Howdy, all of you delicious people. I'm here today to view Daniel Isn't Real. So, the first two initial main appeals to me seeing this film was one, it's available on Tubi, and also Amazon. It's on Prime, I think. So, you can go and definitely check this movie out there. I would recommend it. But then on top of it, Patrick Schwarzenegger was in this movie, and I was like, okay, this is the son of Arnold Schwarzenegger. I remember going on and seeing a photo shoot like thing where Patrick was to look very much like his dad in a Terminator 2 homage, and I was like, oh, okay, like trying to look like his dad, like doing something kind of fun, and so like yeah, like that was kind of cool. So, like, I wanted to just kind of see, it's like, oh, like, he's an actor? Okay, great. Like, let's see what he's going to bring to the table for this film. Come to find out, Patrick's character is very overpowering and, like, is to be very in your face. This character has to be that way, but, like, I was still just like, man, this character, like, can we dial him down a notch? But like I get it. Like this character is to make people crazy. It's supposed to push people over the edge, and so Patrick delivers that. The base of this character. So for this film, of course, I love to compare movies. I would probably call a comparison to this movie to be like Fight Club without the actual Fight Club part in it. Where in Fight Club, you would go on and have a number of people who would go to a basement of a bar and then just punch and hit people. And, like, that, of course, is not in Daniel Isn't Real, like the whole fighting part, but it seems that everything else to the Fight Club movie is to be fairly similar to this film. So, and I won't go on and leave it a mystery of why that is when we, of course, tee up this movie. So, now, why is this movie called Daniel Isn't Real? Well, come to find out, we have at one point Luke who is to see this traumatic event that leads him to have an imaginary friend where they go on and play and have an adventure. And so Luke and Daniel are to be the best of imaginary friends. And then at one point, Luke's hand is forced to then give up his imaginary friend, grow up. And so then Luke at some point is to be in college, and it seems that he is to have a problem with his imagination. It seems that Luke is seeing things. And so we have Luke who goes on and sees his therapist, and the therapist is just like, well, like, how about instead of trying to pull away from this imagination, how about instead you go further into it and you really start to play with your imagination more and like and also try and figure out like the whole origin at the very first time whenever you were a kid where you had an imagination. And so Luke is like, well, I did have an imaginary like friend, and the therapist is like, right there. Like, go on and revisit that, and maybe it'll be something you just need. Maybe it's something you'll need for right now. So Luke decides to then go on and uh, and try to retrace his roots to re-find his imaginary friend Daniel. And so it seems that Daniel is to help Luke become a much more confident person and go on and have Luke meet women, get into these relationships with even more than one woman. But then it seems that if Daniel is to go on and push Luke into the right direction, it seems that Daniel, after that, is to continue to want to keep pushing to the point of Daniel, while Luke isn't looking, Daniel is mocking him. Daniel is going on and seeing what he can get away with while Luke isn't 100% awake, to see how Daniel can possibly open up Luke to an extensive manner to then have Daniel take control. And then, once taking control, Daniel, of course, is to want one thing and one thing only, and that is to really just ruin Luke's life. And so Luke has to figure out a way to get his life back, and maybe that will be a very odd way of putting that for how this movie is to go on end to end. So, with that said, I think it's about that time to just go into a double 5-time territory. I think it's about that time again to, of course, go into this film and go into spoilers, so I can be a little bit more specific. If you were to go on and check out this movie, Daniel Isn't Real, I would highly recommend it. The grading of this movie, if I haven't said that before, solid, good film. I liked it. And some people may not feel that way. Some people may not like the visual style of this film, which I did. I thought the visuals were so unique in this movie, and I was like, yeah, like this was so cool. And like there is so many things from like, man, how did this movie have the money to do this, or the idea of this, like what is the origin of this kind of stuff, where were they thinking, what were the rough drafts of a number of other things. That's kind of the brain of which that I was kind of tweaking away while watching this movie. So let's go into spoiler time. It's about that time we're going to get into spoil. It's my movie. So in the very beginning of the film, we have Luke, who is a young kid, and it seems that Luke is to hear his parents argue in the background, as come to find out Claire is starting to have a mental breakdown because Luke is arguing with her husband, and she doesn't like the medication that she's on. And so Claire is all of a sudden starting to latch out at her husband, and it seems that Claire likes to break a lot of things, to where her husband is like, oh, are you going to break every dish just because you can? So this guy, I'm assuming, just is to have finally have gotten worn out with this woman, to where it's like, dude, I'm done. I can't handle this anymore. So Luke is to retreat, to leave his home, and so come to find out, we have a diner. It seems like a normal run-of-the-mill day. We have this woman behind the counter who's going on like, hey, you want some tea? You want some coffee? You want this? You want that? So all of a sudden we have this guy named John, who ends up rushing his way into this diner to put bullet holes into people, just start shooting away. And I was like, wow, what a weird way to just start out a film. I was like, really just kind of give me like the opening of like, whoa, what is this? So but we come to see next Luke making his way to this same diner, and come to find out we have a guy named John who is outside of the diner, who was to be the shooter in this diner, who is now laying there dead with blood all over the ground. And come to find out, this John character will actually be a key thing to later on in the film. And I was like, wow, like how they kind of work this stuff in was just so interesting. So, as I'm probably going to say interesting a million times here, I apologize. So, Luke all of a sudden is to have a kid appear next to him that is to ask Luke, it's like, well, hey, do you want to go on and play over there? And so Luke's like, sure. So both of them are playing in this playground and they're having a fun time. Claire ends up retrieving Luke to come back for dinner time or whatever. And so Luke is to ask if Daniel can come too. And Claire's like, okay, I'm not seeing anybody. And then Claire's like, oh, like he must just have an imaginary friend now. So I'm gonna go on and kind of tilt down and say like, yeah, Daniel, like you can come on. So Luke and Daniel come back home, and so they have all these adventures, and Luke and Daniel are going on and having all these sword fights with these brooms. And so Claire's looking on at Luke just having uh, fun and having this imagination. And like Claire's like, all right, like my son is just like having fun. Isn't that great? So come to then turn around, we have Daniel at one point manipulating Luke to then find this blender that is to have his mother's smoothie or something in here. And so Daniel ends up going and telling Luke to put these pills in Claire's smoothie. And then Claire ends up at some point drinking the smoothie, and she ends up becoming very ill to the point of her getting very sick. And so Clarice naturally assumed that Luke had to do something with Claire's medication. And so Claire is to go on and trying to discipline Luke by telling Luke to get rid of his imaginary friend. Claire ends up telling Luke to lock Daniel in this dollhouse and keep him there and force him that since Daniel had gone on and done a bad thing, that he needs to be punished and be left in this dollhouse. So Luke then goes on to get this imaginary key, and or this key that is to be imaginary to tie to this dollhouse. And so Luke goes on to tell Daniel to go in the dollhouse, to stay there for however long. So Daniel is stuck into this dollhouse. So some time has passed. Luke has grown up. So Luke, of course, is to be in college. And so Luke, at some point, is to make his way to a number of other students. And Luke is to all of a sudden see these images of these people that freak him out. He all of a sudden starts to see a person who has an entire face that is just skin. Like there is no eyes, there is no nose, there is no mouth, it's just all skin. And so that, of course, is to freak Luke out. And to the point of Luke just kind of on the ground, he's like, oh my god, what is going on? So Luke is to then go on and seek out a therapist who is Braun. And Luke is to say, it's like, well, yeah, like I can just imagine if my mother saw me doing this, like what she would say, because at certain points Claire has gone on and tried everything to try to fix herself, and it just like nothing's worked. So Luke is to go on and say what is going wrong with him, and so the guy is like, well, could be stress related, and Luke is just like, well, like I'm going to college right now, like if I'm not getting like stressed out, then like how can I not be stressed out? So at some point they go on to figure out like that Luke needs to have his run has to have his imagination run wild, and so Luke makes his way back to Claire's place. Come to find out, we have Claire who goes on and really does not like her face in a mirror, to the point to where Claire, it seems, is to break all of her mirrors, and Luke is to notice this and ask his mother about it, and Claire denies that it even happens. But then at some point, Luke does go on and see that Claire is to break these mirrors, and he is to try to clean up after her. But, anyways, so we have Luke that makes his way back to this dollhouse and then goes on to find this key that he remembers having for this dollhouse, and then he unlocks the dollhouse to hope that his friend is going to come back to talk to him again. So Luke, it seems, is having a tough time with his mother as she's continuing to break all these mirrors, to have, of course, Claire now be grabbing scissors and deciding to possibly, like, if she can't solve what's wrong with her, then she can take herself out of the whole equation with a pair of scissors. So Luke and Claire are now wrestling for scissors, and so Daniel then finally reappears as he's in this tub, and Daniel is to go on and tell Luke to either force his mother to kill him, or um, or she dies. So Claire then drops the scissors and realizes what a mistake she had done. So we have Daniel that's like, aha, like I helped you, like I solved your first problem. So Luke is to take Claire and, of course, have her be committed, because if nothing else can help her, then maybe this can. So, while, of course, we have Luke who is cleaning up after his mother, we all of a sudden have a woman named Cassie that arrives and is to notice at some point that Luke had dropped his wallet. Because at some point, when Luke is to be walking in the street, he ends up smacking into a girl named Cassie, and we have Luke who ends up asking Cassie, it's like, well, hey, are you alright? And Cassie's like, yeah, I'm bleeding to death. And Luke is like, are you serious? And Cassie's like, no, like, I'm fine. And so she ends up kind of walking off, but then she kind of does a double take looking at Luke, and she's like, So, come to find out, Cassie is to do the good deed and bring Luke back his wallet. And so Luke ends up rewarding Cassie for doing this. And so she ends up getting this reward. She's like, okay, well, like, I'll turn around and I'll buy paint for this. And every time that I'll paint, I'll think of you. And so Daniel is to go on and say, it's like, hey, Luke, that's your in. Like, she's a painter. Like, just say that you're an artist also. And Luke is like, yeah, I'm an artist too. Like, I'm a photographer. And Daniel's like, you're a photographer? You're not a photographer. Like, if anything, you draw. but you're not a photographer. But so that, of course, is to be like the connection between the two of them. And so Cassie then is to mention, it's like, well, hey, if you're ever like at this one like bar, maybe we can meet up. And Luke is like, oh yeah, that sounds great. So Cassie then walks off, and so Daniel and Luke are like, we found an inn. So Daniel's like, but you're not a photographer though, and Luke ends up finding this camera and is to uh really realize that it's like, well, I guess I'm gonna become a cameraman now. So Luke is to make this way to this location that Cassie is supposed to be. So Luke is to have this camera and is playing around with it because he's never used one before, I'm sure, in his life. So Luke makes his way to where Cassie is supposed to be, and it seems that Cassie is to have an argument with this woman, so much so that Cassie is to have a beer bottle in her hand, willing to throw it at this person because they are having this argument. And so Luke is to kind of pull Cassie aside and just be like, hey, like you're here. So we then have Cassie, of course, that is to go on and have Luke come with her. And so we just have Cassie that takes Luke to go on to her place where Cassie is to have this like cat box like display thing. And I was like, okay, like we have these cats that are in these cubes and like the whole weird display thing, and it's very odd. So, but not only that, we have Cassie who is to have this portrait, and we of course have Cassie asking, it's like, well, like who do you think the portrait is? And Daniel is to immediately say it's her father, and Luke's like, well, I don't know. And so Cassie ends up saying, like, oh, that's my dad. And Luke is like, well, yeah, of course. Like, this is such an amazing portrait, and so on and so forth. And Cassie's like, well, you know what? If you're saying that this is, like, so much better than everything else that I have here, then maybe I should go on and take all of my other art and just destroy it all. And so all of a sudden we have Cassie who is taking this cat box thing and she's just annihilating it. She is having Cassie and Luke just destroy this thing and they're having fun. So it seems that these two are just kind of hitting it off, and so it seems that Luke and Cassie just kind of continue to hang out. But then we also go on and have Luke, who then goes to this party, and we have Daniel that is to tell him, it's like, well, hey, like I want to bet you that you're not going to go on and get a girl's number. And so Luke goes on to go into this party, and Luke ends up going on and seeing this one girl who looks like this actress from this old film. And so Luke ends up talking to Sophie and is to state what she looks like. And this girl is to mention, like, oh, yeah, I know that film exactly because, of course, I am a film buff. Like, that's not, I don't think that's what she ends up going to college for. What she actually is going to college for is psychology. And Luke ends up going and asking Sophie, it's like, well, if you are going to school for psychology, then what am I thinking right now? Sophie starts to think, like, So Sophie ends up saying, what of course Luke was already thinking that she looks like this girl from this film, and Luke is like, "You're exactly right. Whatever you're to say is exactly right." So Sophie seems to be won over by Luke and how like fun he is and how interesting he is. So Luke ends up asking for Sophie's picture, and so Sophie is to kind of want to do like a photo that has kind of interesting lighting. And so they take the photo, and then Sophie is to give Luke her phone number so that way Sophie can get this picture from him, from possibly this digital camera or whatever. So, but I think Luke ends up just kind of developing this in uh, in this kind of black room that he has. So Sophie then leaves, and Luke is to start to party. To start to get really drunk. All of a sudden, Sophie ends up coming back, and then both of them start making out because I'm assuming both of them are very drunk. And it seems that more and more Luke and Sophie are going to possibly become an item. It's like, well, wait a minute, like Luke was already with Cassie. Like we start to we start to see that Luke is like, okay, like I'm starting to be with like too many women at the same time. This doesn't feel right. And Daniel's like, well, just like just keep doing this anyways. Like I'll do it if you won't. So it starts to push. So Luke goes into this bathroom and is to start barfing, start hurling. So Luke at one point is to kind of quickly pass out, and Daniel is to start to realize that he can move Luke's hand to get to this razor, and Daniel is to control Luke's hand to slice this razor a little bit, kind of nick Luke's neck a little bit, to where Daniel's like, aha, like I can have some kind of control here. Like, all right, so let's kind of see how far I can push this. So we have Luke that continues on to be with Cassie and Sophie at the same time, it seems. But so Luke is to go with Cassie to have his portrait being done, and so Cassie ends up doing the portrait, and Luke is shirtless, and Cassie ends up having this kind of shadow into the background, and Luke is like, okay, like why did you draw that shadow? And Cassie's like, I don't know, there's something about you that I think like there's like a shadow that you have. And Luke is just like, okay, that seems interesting. Plus also like the shadow could really just be Daniel, which makes a lot of sense. So to the point where it seems that more and more Cassie is to become even more intuitive than we are led to believe, even to the point where Cassie seems, by the end of this film, to kind of really narrow down uh, possibly what Daniel is to really look like by the end of this film, because it seems that Cassie is to do so many paintings to really just narrow down the real Daniel, which I think is interesting. So, but we'll get to that. So Luke goes with Cassie, and after this whole portrait, they end up making out. They end up going on into bed together. So we have Luke thinking it's like, okay, then I'm like legitimately with Cassie and like no one else. But then we go on and have Luke, who is to have this roommate named Richard, and uh, Luke is to realize that Richard is kind of hard to live with, to the point where Luke decides to put this mask on at some point and try to scare Richard as he's sleeping. And like both Luke and Daniel are having a really good laugh at Richard's expense. Uh, we really go on and have like Daniel that is really to be getting annoyed with Richard, even at one point calling Richard a Muppet. And I thought that that was funny, of course, because I'm laughing. But so we had Luke, and all of a sudden we have Sophie and a friend of hers make her way to Luke's place, and they decide to go on to these or to this steam tunnel. It's like, okay, like why would anybody want to go down there? I guess it's just visually interesting, but why would you go down there legitimately? Like, does it smell great? Probably not. Uh, like, I'm sure it probably doesn't even feel good being down there either. Anyways, so we have our characters in this steam tunnel, and so Richard is to go on and take this one girl by himself, and so now we have Luke and we have Sophie by themselves, and it seems Sophie and Luke are starting to get intimate, and Luke is like, no, like I need to take a moment. Like I think that I'm a lightweight. I think like things are going too fast, and so like I think we should try to slow things down. I think there is also like a whole entire scene with Luke and some girl going to the bookstore as the girl that Luke is with. And I think this might still be Cassie here, where Luke goes to the bookstore with this girl and starts rattling off every page that the girl seems to turn to as Daniel is to read this to him. We also had a moment where Luke was to cheat off this test because Daniel on his body, as Daniel was to be shirtless, had all the answers to this test, and Luke was kind of looking on it and like, yeah, like I can now cheat on this test with Daniel's help. So, but anyways, back to the tunnel. So I just had to cover those moments because I forgot about them. So Luke and Sophie in this steam tunnel. So Luke needs a moment, and it seems that Daniel's like, "What are you doing? Like, this is an opportunity here. Like, you can get with this girl. Like, and so why aren't you like pursuing that?" And Luke is like, "No, like." This isn't right. Like I was already with Cassie. It's double dipping kind of thing. You know what I mean? And it's wrong. And so Daniel's like, well, how would I just go on and I just do it? Like, freaking, I'll, like, let me take the reins, I'll take control. And so Luke is to be drunk and just like, okay, Daniel, like, do it. Like, take over the reins. So Daniel then goes on to take over the body of Luke, and we have Daniel that is pushing this girl and like doing it right then and there. And then the further and further that Daniel is to kind of really push this girl, we all of a sudden have Richard who ends up coming back and gets in an argument with this just being Daniel. So Daniel goes on and is to grab Richard and push his face into this steam pipe, and Richard ends up burning his face. So we then turn around and have Richard, who is in this hospital, and Luke wanted to try to get control of Daniel's or like Luke wanted to get control of his body back, and when Luke was to try to get control, he then all of a sudden has his hand kind of break off. So when Daniel ends up getting knocked out here, come to find out Luke is to take back control. So it's like, okay, we can see or understand like whenever there is to be like some head injury or there seems to be like a point where like these characters get knocked out, the other person can kind of go on and try to regain control or gain control. So Luke is now back in the driver's seat and is very upset with Daniel, thinking it's like, hey, I could go on to jail for this, and Daniel could care less. So Luke is to finally tell Daniel, it's like, well, you know what? When I get to the count of three, you're gonna be gone. So Luke ends up counting 1, 2, 3, opens his eyes. Daniel's right there, right in his face. So Luke's like, wow, like, you know what, if I imagined you, like, I should be able to get rid of you. And Daniel's like, well, it doesn't work that way. So come to find out, Daniel is just making Luke more and more crazed to the point where Luke cannot sleep. And so Luke is driven to the point of him desperately needing to go on and re-meet up again with his therapist. And so Braun is to go on and use this Tibetan singing bowl, and Braun is to try to not only hypnotize Luke, but then is to also try and hypnotize himself, to both have them go under so Braun can understand what's going on with Daniel. So we have Braun who is to use this singing bowl, spinning around, like, okay, like, Daniel, like, let's talk. Daniel, let's talk. And so Daniel ends up getting right into Braun's face and is to yell the words, about what? Braun ends up getting scared, and he's like, oh my god. So Daniel then again is to want to take control of the situation, and so we have Luke who's laying on this couch, and Daniel is telling Luke, it's like, this is really gonna hurt. So Daniel ends up stretching out Luke's jaw to an absurd degree, and then Daniel is to slide into Luke's body head first, and then we find out that Daniel again is taking absolute control, and they break, both Braun and Luke being hypnotized. And so Daniel again is to try and take control here. But we also have a scene where Luke is to try and figure out if there is a connection between Luke and the guy that had died at this diner. So Luke tries to track down the father of the guy who's named John to see if there's a connection there. So Luke meets up with a guy named Percy and makes his way into his place, and Luke ends up asking Percy, it's like, well, hey, was there anything that this guy had? Like, did he do anything special? And Percy was to say, it's like, well, like, he used to draw a lot. And so Luke is like, okay, like, do you happen to have any drawings of, like, what he would draw? And so Percy's like, well, yeah, one of them's on the fridge. I'm like, why would this guy, after all this time, still have this stuff? But, like, you just have to suspend disbelief. So, maybe the grief of his son dying was to just kind of trigger, it's like, okay, I've never cleaned any of this stuff out. Like it's hard to give up or believe that my son is dead, so on and so forth. So Luke goes into this guy's room and is to realize that the drawing that John was to make was the exact same drawing of what Cassie did of what this imaginary friend is to look like of Luke's. And so then all of a sudden we start to realize that John's imaginary friend was Daniel. And so Luke is to now make the comparison here, just like, okay, wait a minute, like, this must be something that switched over from John to now me, and no wonder that this guy just went crazy and lost his mind, because this thing was trying to take hold and take control, and so this guy just wanted to figure out a way out, sadly enough. So Daniel is to go on and take full control, to the point of him going on and him only playing with the one kind of chess piece that Luke has left, as when Luke was to try to meet back up with Sophie, Sophie wants nothing to do with Luke. Sophie ends up macing Luke in the face, as Daniel was to go on and play around with Sophie and look like he slices her neck open, and blood ends up coming into Luke's face, and Luke ends up freaking out about all the blood that he is to see on his body, and come to find out it was Daniel playing with him. And Luke then is to get maced in the face because he is to seem crazed. So now Daniel goes on and meets with Cassie, and we have Daniel that is starting to realize in Cassie's place that she had drawn what Daniel really looks like. As we also had a moment where Luke was to see what Daniel really looks like also, as Luke was to shout, or was to say in front of Daniel consistently, "Get in, get in, get in." As of course Luke had gone on to shout that before to Daniel to tell him to get in the dollhouse. So but Daniel ends up taking control. So while Daniel is to now realize that Cassie knows too much, that Daniel is going to have to do away with Cassie because it seems like she is to be too smart for her own good, to the point of Daniel, who is to get these new threads, to get these new clothing, and Cassie is to draw that same outfit, and is to also see that Luke has had this like slick back hair, which is very different from this character. So than we're used to seeing of him. So while that's going on, we also have Luke, who is in the mind of himself, and he is in this kind of castle of his own mind, and he is being chased by this unusual looking monster. And so, if we haven't gone on and seen Luke kind of fuse with Daniel and see like the weird, goofy visuals that end up being tied to that, we then see this character that is to have this kind of face that kind of has like these things that are kind of off to the side here. Very interesting visual. So Luke is to be chased around by this character, and when Luke finally goes on and is to confront this person, come to find out, Luke is to realize as he stabs into him, it's like, oh my god, you're John, aren't you? And John ends up saying yes. So, like, oh my god. So, yeah, like, this guy, when he goes on and, like, he kills the previous person, like, he basically takes their soul and is to, like, take a piece of them with him. And so I was like, wow, that's kind of creative. So, Luke is to get this phone call and he is to pick it up and find out that Daniel and Cassie are talking. And so Luke is like, oh my god, like Cassie's gonna get killed by Daniel, and like there's nothing I can do to stop this. So when it seems that Cassie is trying to run away from Daniel, and then she goes on to take Daniel, grab him, and is to continue to start smashing his head onto the rooftop of this place that she's at, we start to see that Luke can make his way out of here. And so Luke is to ask John what is beyond these doors, and John is to reply that it's the abyss. So Luke, not really knowing what he meant by that, Luke just goes in to this weird, unusual abyss and dives. So Luke then reappears and is to now try and fight off Daniel, and is to try to regain control of his own body. So Luke and Daniel are to now again on this rooftop find these brooms, and they are starting to sword fight again. But this time around, the brooms actually look like swords this time around, so it's a legitimate sword fight. So we have these two sword fighting, and it looks pretty decent. So coming to find out, we have Luke that is to realize that this is to only end one way, and that it'll lead to possibly Luke needing to end his own life. So Luke and Daniel are to go on and fall off to the side of this building, and Daniel's like, you're not strong enough to do something like this. And Luke ends up pushing them off to the side, and they end up falling to their death. You would think then, like, they would kind of put this movie to where there would just be, like, another film where someone would go on and find Luke dead, or Cassie would end up with his imaginary friend next. But it seems that Cassie, again, would know too much, and so on and so forth. As Cassie, while Luke and Daniel were fighting, she was going down this ladder that was off to the side of this building, so that way she could scramble out of this situation. So she was safe. But so Luke had gone on to take his own life, and that is the way the movie just kind of finishes up here. But yeah, so come to find out that this was some imaginary friend-like demon. If there's anything that I did forget about in this movie, I'd try to go on and and cover most of the scenes as much as I could. There was some stuff that I did have to I always hate it. There's a lot of times where I think about like going into a scene and then all of a sudden there's like 4 or 5 different scenes that I completely forgot about, and then I'm like, oh crap. So I have to kind of go back into a certain scene after I've gone on and explained 4 or 5 things that I forgot about. Um, but like that's just my thought of just like, well, if it's something that happened prior, like I'll go and mention it, and then I'll come back to the current scene and just kind of introduce it and so on and so forth, because that's just how I review. That's where my brain goes. I know it's not perfect, but I could just say, hey, at the end of the day, check out Daniel Isn't Real for your own variation of seeing this movie and enjoying it, and seeing it in the correct way of which that this movie is a thing. So I'm gonna go on and just get out of here, so I can hopefully maybe squeak out one more review, or just call it a day, because I'm just um, tired. Weirdly. Um, Actually, not really weirdly, but anyways, I'm just gonna get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.